Welcome to SouthCoast Matters. I'm Paul Attendra.
And I'm Julie Taylor. And SouthCoast Matters is a public access television program where we bring together business leaders, civic leaders, and citizens to discuss how we can work in harmony to make the South Coast communities a better place to live.
And we try to have some intelligent conversations with some fairly knowledgeable people. Today we're fortunate to have Evan Falchuk back. Evan's the founder and director of the United Independent Party.
And a little bit more background is he's a successful entrepreneur, served for 14 years on the executive leadership team of the Boston-based global healthcare company Best Doctors, Inc., and played a leading role in growing the company from 9 employees to over 600. Wow.
And Evan graduated from Penn Law School. He spent a few years working for a law firm before he went to work for the Best Doctors. He has 2 daughters, 1 son, 1 wife, 1 dog. Welcome back, Evan.
Thanks for having me.
Evan, today it's going to be the first show of our new season. So we'd like to talk about, even though we're wearing the same things as the last show of our last season, we'd like to talk about that intersection between business and government. Most people, we look at government, we look at business, and we consider them 2 different things. I worked in a corporate world. I hated government. And when you live in a corporate world, you don't want any government people coming in. You don't want to know anything. You just keep them as far away as possible. Now that I'm retired and looking at the world slightly differently, no matter the air we breathe, the water we drink, everything we eat is a combination of government and business working together to make those things clean and viable and safe. And
I think there'll be a much more integrated involvement between the 2 entities going forward because tax dollars are not as abundant as we'd like them to be. So we're going to see more of government and business working together, I think.
Well, I would hope so.
Yeah.
I think as Americans too, I don't know, how do you feel about this, but I think we have an unrealistic expectation that things are going to be fair. And things aren't fair. I was born with beauty and intelligence.
Right.
No, that was you, I'm sorry. But things aren't fair, and they're never going to be fair. And really, in America, things are as fair as your checkbook stretches. And
yeah, I mean, I tend to be a little bit more idealistic than you about these things, because I do think things can be fair and they can be fairer. Talking as a business person with obviously an interest in work that I'm doing in politics as well, that for businesses, especially the small and medium-sized businesses that are the ones that drive growth in the 21st century.
And they're getting crushed.
They are, and some of it is to do with the government regulation, but so much of it has to do with how much it costs for healthcare, how much it costs for you to pay your workers, because the worker has to be able to afford to work for you. And government has a really important constructive role to play here. So it becomes easy, and I think so often when we see the left-right politics of our country these days, you got one side saying, don't you care about clean air and clean water, and the other side saying the government is here to tell you lies about global warming. And you say, that's just not relevant to me as a business person. What I need to know is, why do I have to pay so much? Why am I getting a 20 or 30% increase in my healthcare costs? What's going on that my workers tell me that they can't afford to work for me because they've got to pay $1,200 a month in rent, that they can't afford to take the job that I have? The government has to make sure. So what's causing healthcare costs to be so high is that these hospitals have merged into these big systems. Governments let them do it. And when they merge, they raise their prices. That comes out of your pocket. The government has a role to play to stop that from happening. It's not doing it. So the question becomes, when is it going to start? That's why we need to elect new people.
That all has to do with the corporate business model right now, which is get bigger, take a much bigger slice of the market share, control the cost.
Absolutely.
You control your costs coming in from your vendors because you're controlling 70% of the market now.
Right.
So you tell them what you're going to pay. They don't tell you what they're going to charge you. and then you can charge whatever you need to charge on the other end to make sure you can still crush your smaller competitors who have to pay street price for those same items.
This is the story of, this is the reality of capitalism, which is the best system that there is, but it also has these failings in it. And we've known in this country for well over 100 years that monopolies happen, and monopolies are bad for consumers, and that government's job is to make sure that those monopolies don't happen. The trouble we have, and this is not just a Massachusetts issue, this is happening all around America, is that hospitals have been merging into these bigger and bigger conglomerates, insurance companies too, and both sides are squeezing the consumer in between them. The government should be breaking up those monopolies. The government should be doing
Well, they
rate
used
regulation.
to break them up.
They used to. They stopped. It's not a surprise that you see the ability of big hospital systems to get legislation passed at the drop of a hat. There was a proposed ballot question to regulate pricing of hospitals that was put together in order to directly address the problem that these monopolies have caused. And there was a deal done earlier this year that happened almost overnight to get rid of that ballot question and to basically not do anything but preserve the status quo. Why does that happen? It's because these organizations, these big hospital systems are really politically connected. They give a lot of money. They give a lot of money to political candidates, and that means that they can get what they want when it comes to a regulatory environment that suits them. That can't be allowed to happen. So when we talk about how to make things fair, how to make it so that businesses can thrive and prosper, let's look at their probably biggest cost, and that has to do with healthcare costs, and let's deal with the root causes of the problem.
Exactly. And that recent, earlier this year, that question you're referring to was going to take money from the more profitable hospitals and funnel it down to the community hospitals
Correct.
that are really hurting.
Yeah, and the deal that they cut preserved all the pricing disparities. In other words, the big hospitals charge this much for, you hear about people going to the doctor and getting an x-ray and get a bill for $600 or something crazy like this. Well, that's been preserved. And what they did was they did give some money to community hospitals, but they took the money out of the one agency in state government that does a really great job of looking at how the market works. They took, I think it was $25 million out of that agency and gave it to the community hospitals. So the money went to a good place. The community hospitals need support, but they did it by looting the agency that looks at how pricing works in Massachusetts. So in many ways, this is a step backwards, not a step forwards.
Yeah, and I think that healthcare, this is another whole different show, but that's something that we all need to pay very close attention to.
Absolutely.
Because there's a lot of that unfairness, as some of us would define it.
Let me bring it back to a hypothetical. I know your family was in the clothing industry a few generations
Absolutely.
back.
My mother's side, yeah.
Okay. If someone wanted to open a clothing store in downtown Fall River, New Bedford, Taunton now, forget about it. Forget about it. There's one, they could probably buy retail cheaper than they could buy on the wholesale market. Two, they couldn't get big name designers in because they couldn't afford the up charges that supposedly are given back to huge retailers. They wouldn't stand a shot.
It's difficult for any kind of manufacturing these days, but the government, again, has a role to play, because if we can lower the cost of doing business here, this is why I talk about healthcare, but also think about the tax credits and tax breaks that are given out. I know there's been a lot of talk about GE getting $150 million from the state. Imagine if that $150 million could be given to small manufacturers. Some organization wants to build a clothing manufacturing shop in Fall River in an old mill. Maybe it would take a bit of money to make that happen, but I think there's much more creative ways to use taxpayer money.
There is a shirt maker in Fall River, by the way. But,
yeah.
The problem too is, another problem is, what do we call small business?
50 or less employees, or is it? Do you break it off at a certain revenue level?
I think the government's description is 3,000 to 4,000 employees is still small business.
Well,
now to me that's
a pretty big business.
I had, when I was in Canada, I had 400 something employees, and we had $450 million worth of revenue, and I thought that was big, but that's small now.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty big business. I mean, the companies that are really driving our growth are the smaller businesses, and some of them are the mom and pop kind of shops, but a lot of them are these startups, these people that are doing creative and interesting things that bootstrap and just work hard to beg, borrow, and steal and get themselves going and raise some money, but they don't get the attention from the government that they ought to.
they get just the opposite. The smaller they get, small restaurants, to me, that's the epitome of a mom and pop restaurant, the epitome of a small business. They get more regulatory fees they have to pay for a dairy license, a food handler's license. Yeah.
And by contrast, the bigger you get as a business, the more you get. So if General Electric wants a helipad built in Boston, they get it, paid for by the taxpayers. If you're a restaurant looking for some variance on some construction you want to do, good luck.
Yeah,
good luck. That's not fair. And that isn't the kind of unfair that you say life isn't fair. That's the kind of unfair where there are people responsible for doing that and they're doing it wrong.
So regulatory unfairness.
Unfair, absolutely. And it doesn't have to be that way.
I think agree. In the last gubernatorial round, many of the candidates were talking about making the permitting process and that whole business startup thing more streamlined, one-stop shop where you knew what to expect, and trying to get people to move more towards that type of a model so that we could encourage businesses. So I don't know if that's continued to move forward.
It has. To be fair, Governor Baker actually has moved forward on a number of those initiatives. We still have that underlying deeper, more systematic failing, which is the giving out of the big tax breaks to the big companies. That's a you know, it's a misuse of government resources at a time when we need to fund our schools. We got to fund transportation. We got to make sure that people can afford housing, where we have to be using the government to break up monopolistic behavior. Giving away money like that to companies with $100 billion in cash in the bank, it's not right.
Right.
Infrastructure needs
Absolutely.
A lot of help. Extra structure too. I mean, telephone poles, how long are they going to last? I mean, most of them are over 100 years old now. So.
Yeah.
Were there any incentives in the GE deal that you know of to contribute towards any type of infrastructure, especially where they're over in the Seaport
well,
district?
there will be some building that gets done, but there's nothing that's coming from GE. Subsequent to the deal being done, GE came back so they would donate some money to schools and for some other programs, and that's wonderful and good. And one would hope a company like General Electric would do that anyway.
Right.
But no, this is sort of the fantasy. This happened when we were dealing with the Olympics last year, that if we have this big thing going on, it's going to create new infrastructure investments. Well, if you've been to that part of Boston where GE is locating itself to, it is being built up like mad. It's one of the most fastest growing areas with lots of money in the country, if not the world. And so the idea that you need to give tax incentives to a hugely rich company in order to do it, there's a lot of infrastructure needs there. The public transit system in that part of town is not good. And of course, as you go further outside of Boston, we have a $7 billion need to get the T running on a state of good repair. There's no plan to build SouthCoast Rail, which is needed for the South Coast region. There's no real plan to figure out how to make more connections regionally in our transit system. And we need to have those kinds of discussions and have plans to actually figure out how to do them. But instead, we do this very short-term kind of planning.
So how do you bring business to the table with local government or regional government or state government to kind of move these sorts of ideas forward in a partnership?
How does Boston get that if Atlanta's offering GE $300 million?
Well, GE is a smart company. And GE
I know
said,
that, yeah.
well, but this is how. GE said it wants to be in a place where there's an ecosystem, an entrepreneurial ecosystem. That's Boston.
Yeah.
Atlanta may be a nice city, but it doesn't have that.
Maybe Seattle might be the only option.
Yeah, or Raleigh in North Carolina. But you know, something like Boston is much, much better. Plus it's close to New York. Plus it's close to Europe. I mean, we have
great institutions of higher learning.
Institutions of higher learning. This is the place that you'd want to be. Really, if you think about on Earth, there's very few places other than Boston that's a company like that could relocate to. So they're coming here one way or the other. And it becomes a question of leadership in government. So our government should be able to look at a company like GE and say, listen, we know you want to come here because there's all this great stuff happening here. So please come. We'll be happy to have you. There's nothing wrong with giving out some kind of incentive to people, but there's a level where it turns into $150 million, where there's such need in other areas where you say that's not leadership. So believe me, the folks at GE are pretty hard-nosed business people, and when they're sitting down with the state government, they can tell whether they've got someone on the other side of the table that they can play and get those $150 million out of, and they did. So it's unfortunate, but it starts with leadership. It starts with having people that have a vision of how things ought to work. Let's look at why GE wanted to come here. It's because of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. That happens because of the universities. It happens because of the people that are here, the talent. We need to do everything we can to make sure that that's kept and that people can afford to live here and do business here.
Outside of GE, how do we bring new business to the area without tapping taxpayer dollars?
I fundamentally, in the 21st century, it's about lowering the cost of doing business here and lowering the cost of living. It's not about the taxes. I can say this as a business person. Yes, taxes they're there. It's a cost you got to pay almost anywhere you go. But the real money is in what I've got to pay for healthcare costs. It's what I've got to pay in salaries for people. Remember, those salaries are tied to how high the rents are where people live. So if you had a vision of how to build business, you'd say, I got to drive down the cost of living. I got to make it so that we have a education system that's second to none, so people want to bring their kids here, so that there's a T that gets you around, so it's easy to move around places, so that there's lots of homes built near transit that are affordable, so people have money in their pocket. That's how you build business.
Sounds like a South Coast, we have a prime ground for it.
I'm telling you,
we
there's...
have good education,
You
we
do.
have transportation's very iffy down here. Housing's fairly low. Labor markets right now, we're underpaying our labor market by 30% anyway.
Taunton and the South Coast area are terrific for that.
Yeah, we do need to raise the education level a little bit in order to compete for some jobs here.
Yeah, job training. You know, there were cuts in job training in the most recent budget that was passed. In fact, the legislature cut more than what the governor asked for. So here we have in Massachusetts a Republican governor who you'd think would be cutting things, but it's actually the Democratic legislature that cut even more from programs of job training for people across the spectrum, including veterans and others. So we've got a leadership issue where we need to elect people that want to see that happen.
People with a vision, not so much somebody who wants to manage everything, but someone who can kind of get us on board to move forward with where we're going to go.
We need lots of people like that. Right. Absolutely right.
At every level.
I'm going to interrupt. I want to play a film clip from a guest we had a few weeks ago.
Sure.
We had Don Berwick here.
Good man.
And he was discussing insurance companies, which we just talked about. And can we have that film clip? Insurance companies survive on 10%.
They're doing it somewhere.
Are they profitable?
Yeah, well, I'm not a particular enthusiast of bashing insurers. I know these people. You know, they're like the rest of us. They go to work trying to do a good job. They're playing the game. What I say is they're playing the game the way we wrote the rules. So when when the batter swings the bat legally, you can't blame them for doing that. That you wrote the rule. You don't want them to swing the bat that way. Change the rule. That's how I think of the insurance thing. But right now, the insurers are playing a game which allows them to have very high overhead and, by the way, very high profits. And insurance companies make a ton of money.
Basically, I don't know if you're able to hear that.
I heard it.
Okay. To me, that's the crux of where we have to do a better job of having government regulate business. As a businessman, I used to find myself thinking, I need to get the biggest amount of cash down to the corporate office as possible. That's my job.
Sure.
And the best way to get more cash down to the corporate office is to keep salaries down, to cut costs wherever. Most in the business I was in, labor was a big cost. We and all sell stuff for more money. That's the other end. But there's a point at which I think government has to tell the corporation, you have to pay more. You have to, minimum wage is what it was 25 years ago or something, 30 years ago, in real dollars. That minimum wage doesn't support our workers enough that we have the government has to kick more money in now to your full-time workers.
Right. I mean, we see it with companies like Walmart that have employees on Medicaid because they can't afford to buy insurance. I mean, that's not fair either. To what Don was talking about, he's right that the health insurers make a lot of money, but let's also keep in mind that there's health care, which is what the hospitals and doctors deliver, and there's health insurance, which is how you pay for it. And the health insurance price is pretty much entirely 85% driven by the price of the health care. When these hospitals keep merging like they have been and raising their prices, that flows right through the insurance company and flows to our pockets. So he's right that the insurers are playing by the rules, and we should be doing things to make sure that insurers aren't doing abusive practices. But we can't miss out on the fact that the underlying root cause of the problem are the hospitals raising their prices year after year after year.
And the doctors probably aren't getting.
Doctors are not in a great place. I mean, they've got to see 30, 40 patients a day. It's not as attractive to be a doctor as it once was. It's not treated with the same degree of independence and respect that it once was. It's been squashed in these efforts to try to cut costs. But if we could just address this issue of the hospital monopolies and change the way in which they're paid, so we can make sure that we're paying for quality care, change the incentives so that we're paying for people to be kept well rather than waiting for them to get sick. There's a lot of ways in which this can be done, but again, it requires imagination, and it also requires that you're not beholden to the hospital systems that are putting so much money into our politics today.
There was a recent article just to that point that when it comes to the ambulance companies,
Yep.
rather than pay them for a quick response time, they wanted to pay them more based on outcome.
Yeah.
To make sure that they got the proper care, not necessarily just run there and transport them to the hospital, but make sure they actually got a good outcome. So maybe that goes to what
It's
you
a
were
good
talking
example.
about. That
Well, it's a great example.
we can't just pay for a procedure. We should be focused on outcome.
Absolutely. The way that hospitals and doctors are paid these days, if a person is diabetic and isn't taking care of themselves and ends up in the hospital getting a foot amputated, that actually for them works out financially, even though it's terrible from a public health standpoint. There's ways, and we've proposed a lot of this at unitedindependent.org, to change the system so that you incentivize the hospital to go into the community and help people manage their diabetes so that they don't come into the hospital. And that's, changes the way they make money. But so long as we don't address that underlying problem, we're going to continue to be living in this world where 20, 30% a year increase in health insurance premiums without any kind of end in sight. And that, if we're talking about how to build business, that's so much of what drives the costs that these businesses face, and it takes so much money out of people's pockets.
Right, and I think people have to get vocal about this and stop maybe just sitting there. Well, there really isn't anything I can do about it. I got to pay this. I got to pay that.
I think
get them angry.
There's an inherent belief in a lot of people that government has no business telling them what to charge or how to charge, even though we all depend on government telling them how to charge and what services to provide and how safely to provide those services.
Right. Sometimes the market fails, and I think in general the market should be the first way to go, but when it fails, that's what the government's there for. The first person to really drive that home was Teddy Roosevelt, I think the most famously anyway. He was a good Republican. He believed in trying to use government to protect people from the excesses of the system. But he was a big believer in the free market, as am I, and as are people with the United Independent Party. So there's a role to play. It just needs to be done in the right way.
And he also busted up the mega corps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So going to another fairness issue. Paul and I talked about this earlier today. The whole Citizens United thing.
Yeah.
Where now suddenly
Great
corporations
example. Yeah.
have this huge outside influence to just spend, and then regular people like us cannot possibly meet what
Correct.
they spend to influence the same legislation.
Yep.
And I think in some ways that's out of control, where they've controlled the agenda and can make the rules that they want the system to play by. We're sort of
agreed.
stuck.
Or regular people like us don't know the facts because we're bombarded with one side.
Or the
So
ads that don't say who pays for the ad that tells you these
exactly.
wonderful stories.
Well, think our democracy is supposed to be for people. And by people, I mean human beings.
Right.
Corporations are not people. That should be very clear, but they're able to donate as if they were. They can't vote, but they certainly influence things. So we ought to have publicly funded elections. I think we ought to. I'm also realistic in the sense that I look at the people in our government today, none of them are going to vote for publicly funded elections. And that leaves us stuck. What do? But we have to organize, which is why we created United Independent Party. We have to find a way to get new people elected so we can fill our legislatures all across the country with people who want to see publicly funded elections and who will vote to make them into a reality.
Exactly.
That'll happen probably before you die, not before I die. But
Well, it depends how long we're all willing to.
Yeah,
to
there you
but
go, there you go.
All these things take time and effort, and they're all worth it because our democracy is worth it.
constant, consistent baby steps.
Right.
Just
Correct.
keep
It
moving
moves
the
at the
ball.
speed of a glacier sometimes, so it seems.
Oh, it has been. It sometimes moves backwards too.
These glaciers are moving much more quickly these days, so watch it.
Yeah, especially with the growth of the United Independent Party,
got it.
keeping that third,
Exactly right.
that third voice there.
What else? How can government make business more profitable and more socially conscious at the same time?
Well, businesses, people, which people are the ones really behind businesses. And I've found from talking to business people all across Massachusetts that they want to do lots of great things beyond what the business does. And so many of them do. You see so many businesses involved in charitable activities and all these things. It's always a challenge when you're not making as much money as you'd like and there's uncertain economic times. And so for businesses, it's all about, as you were pointing out, money coming in and how much are you spending going out. If you can reduce how much you spend going out, there's more money available to hire more people, to do more publicly minded things.
Arithmetic dictates actions.
It's reality. So, I don't think it's right to say that what we need to do is force businesses to do certain things that we want them to do. I don't think that's the right role for government. But I do think that the more we can do as government to reduce the cost of business, make it cheaper for people to do business here, make it easier for people to do business here, the more benefit that brings to everybody.
Do you think that business in the Commonwealth is over-regulated?
Well, I think business everywhere is pretty heavily regulated these days. But again, the challenge I hear from so many people is some of it's very local. So it's a question of what town you're in and how that town happens to deal with its zoning issues and its permitting issues, and a lot of that stuff is really excessive. And then there's the cost issue, which is as big as any of these other issues, where you say, listen, if I could cut your costs by 10 or 15% by addressing the issues that we've been talking about here tonight, wouldn't that be a good thing? Of course it would. You'd hire another person. You'd buy another piece of equipment.
I'll disagree with you a little bit. I think small, medium-sized businesses, 1,000 people or less business,
Yeah.
is probably over-regulated. Very large businesses pretty much write their own regulations, I think, for the most part.
It's an unfair system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're talking about lobbyists getting in there.
Amazon's not over-regulated.
Right.
They're having probably trouble getting permission to run their drone delivery service.
Yeah.
It's cheaper than paying a person, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, no doubt. Yeah. And to me, that's the other facet of life that your generation will have to deal with is technology's eliminated a lot of jobs, and it's dumbed down a lot of jobs, and there won't be enough real work for everyone in the future. We're going to have more people, and we have ability to feed those people and house those people, but not enough. We don't really have work for all those people. We have,
Right.
And how do we deal with that sociologically? How do we make sure we're not starving people, because they might have the will to work, but there will be no work.
Yeah, we have some challenges over the next, say, 50 to 100 years that are just like what you described. And I think people have been talking for many decades about the idea that automation, technology will make it so that people don't have to work. We're probably now actually starting to live through the beginnings of that era. It's happening. So what do we do about it?
Yeah.
I still think that we
don't know how to manage it. Yeah.
I think we underestimate the creative drive of a capitalist economy like ours, that people will find ways to do things.
They will.
And I think we also underestimate the extent to which we may need to come up with creative new ways of supporting people in these kinds of environments. Look, the idea of a social welfare state, it was actually a creation of the late 19th century. It wasn't until before then that we even had the idea of providing people job training, unemployment insurance, health insurance. This was never a part of the thing. So we're now in that era where we have to build what things are going to look like over the next 100 years. So people will say, geez, that early 21st century, there were some smart people that did something that was built that made us into what we are today.
We're in that era, and we're at the end of our show. So.
But that will
Evan
be a
Falchuk.
fascinating subject for another show,
Oh,
to
will
talk
be.
about that
Yeah.
work of the future.
My name is Paul Latendra. Thank you, Evan Falchuk, for
Thank you.
being with us. Thank you to TCAM, folks at TCAM, for providing us a studio and much advice here on how to run these shows.
And I'm Julie Taylor, and look for us on Facebook at South Coast Matters and southcoastmatters@gmail.com. We welcome comments and suggestions.
Thank you for joining us.